get lots of requests to address a particular topic of interest to my viewers. None has come up more often and with greater frequency than GMOs. What people really want to know about is genetically modified food crops. I first want to say that I have a slight conflict of interest here. The biotech company that employs me doesn't make any GMO products, but they do make some of the tests for screening food products for GMOs. This is one of the reasons I've been somewhat reluctant to address this topic. I'm in a completely different division, but my company might benefit from increased demand for GMO screening of food products. Fair warning. The term frankenfood describes very accurately how some people think about transgenic crops. Science gone amok, tampering with nature in an amoral way, driven by greed and hubris. The reality is a bit more complex. While some manufacturers are seeking ways to increase profits through DNA technology, others are developing some very important modifications that nature is either too slow or unwilling to do for us. I'm going to do this as a pros and cons list because it is such a complex topic. Some examples of positive applications. Drought-resistant crops. While humans have been using artificial means to select for certain traits in our food crops for thousands of years, it's only in the last 2 decades that we finally have the technology to directly select the gene variants we like, allowing us to bypass certain natural limitations on what traits can be expressed together. One such innovation is drought resistance, or low water usage crops that are sustainable and can provide adequate nutrition. An example is a variety of maize that outproduces the wild type by 40% during extended droughts. Imagine the impact this could have for world starvation and poverty. Pathogen-resistant crops. This is the largest commercial application for transgenics. Roundup-ready varieties are resistant to herbicides that kill weeds that don't have the transgene. The reason this is a good thing is that the weeds use water, so weedless fields are more water efficient. There are also varieties of corn and soy that have genes for natural pesticides, normally found in a bacteria that colonizes plants and caterpillars. This reduces the amount of expensive and harmful pesticide that must be used to prevent crop loss. High-yield crops. The general global trend towards urbanization means that people are getting further from the crops that sustain them. This requires more transportation and infrastructure, which consumes more resources and causes greater environmental impact. The more food we can produce per acre, the shorter the transport distance required. Higher yields also keep the cost of food low and the availability high, so that people can afford to eat healthy, nourishing meals and stave off hunger and disease. Growth of agricultural land usually has a negative impact on the local indigenous environment, so transgenic high-yield crops can have a positive impact on the environment as well. Edible vaccines. If I made a Venn diagram of anti-vaccine and anti-GMO activists, I suspect there's not going to be a lot of non-overlap, so they're going to love this application. Progress is being made on introducing vaccines into plants, especially fruits, although potatoes are also very useful. The idea is that they would be an incredibly cheap, easy to transport, and easy to administer way of vaccinating populations in remote areas or areas affected by poverty and infrastructure problems. Green production. One of the possible alternatives to oil is biomass or plant energy production. Former President Bush advocated for switchgrass cellulosic ethanol production, a resource that could be cheaply harvested and would provide a seamless near-term solution to our dependence on petroleum. There's only one problem. The conversion of cellulose to ethanol isn't very efficient. Enter biotechnology. Cellulose hydrolysis is the current rate-limiting step. We can enhance that process with enzymes called cellulases that split apart the long chains of cellulose into short sugars. Introducing that enhanced cellulose pathway into a bacteria may result in bioreactors that eat lawn clippings and generate biofuels. So that's the potential upside of GMOs. What about the objections to genetic engineering of food crops? I'll break it down and rank the various objections by the amount of logical value I see in them, lowest to highest. Moral or religious objections. We're playing God. The reason I rank this the lowest is that we've been playing God for over 1,000 years. Other animals have too. Insects are the reason some plants make flowers. We eat the sweetest berries. We harvest the largest seeds. The plants with those genes get favored by a broader dispersal. We are an agent of selection, which plays into the process of evolution that began over 2.8 billion years ago. Today we are the weather, the ecology, and the fitness landscape. But that's just plants. The issue that makes people a bit more squeamish is modifying animals. The EnviroPig has been selected for its reduced phosphate excretion. This is both less smelly and better for the environment, although it raises questions about our role as stewards of our planet. We've been modifying wild animals by the same processes of selective breeding, so that we've produced the Chihuahua from the wolf lineage. These selectively bred animals have health problems, of course, but a wolf won't guard sheep or help search for lost children or drug shipments. There's a difference between breeding a trait over 1,000 years and producing it in a year in a lab. But I want to react to specific evidence in actual cases, not hand-waving and fear-mongering. There may be some cases where genetic modification can save lives, improve living conditions, and minimize our environmental impact. There may also be cases that really are endangering our ecosystem. Safety of consumption. I can see why this is a very common objection to GMO. We have very little data what the effects of introducing foreign DNA and proteins into a food crop will be on our health. However, there's little evidence to suggest that GMO crops don't have the same level of nutrient content. A classic example is the Flavor Saver tomato. Scientists inactivated a gene product that degrades pectin in the tomato, allowing it to reach market without softening or rotting. It's a matter of turning off a product currently being made by the tomato rather than adding a new protein. Some describe the flavor as bad, but that may have more to do with the particular tomato that they chose to modify, rather than the genetic modification itself. More recent revisions are still being sold as premium hothouse tomatoes. Outcrossing or contamination of wild strains. There is a risk that whatever modification we make to a crop will be transferred to another non-crop plant. There is some evidence that this is possible, but no confirmation that it has occurred in the wild, so to speak. 90% of the U.S. soybean crop and 70% of the corn crop contain the Roundup Ready transgene. We've seen the evolution of resistance in weeds, but it's not a match with the introduced transgene sequence. So it appears that overuse of Roundup, and not the GMO itself, is the bigger threat. I think you can make a reasonable case that this is an indirect cause, because farmers can be indiscriminate in their spraying. Environmental consequences. A possible consequence of high-yield GMO varieties is the same as a non-GMO high-yield variety, and that is soil depletion. The more that plants are able to take out of the soil, the more we have to put back in. It also means a more tempting food source for the insect or pathogen that can exploit it. That means water, fertilizer, insecticide, herbicide, fungicide, and other chemical preventatives. I'm describing what's called in agricultural circles the scale-up problem. The more yield you get, the more chemicals you need. I think this is a very serious risk for developing nations that are desperate to equalize the trade imbalance with agricultural superpowers like the U.S. It can contribute to serious, permanent ecological damage. As I mentioned, I think GMO, or at least selective breeding, can also be the solution to this problem, but it won't come without a radical change in the way we conduct agriculture around the world. Corporatization of food crops. This is, I think, the scariest and most real of the concerns about GMO crops. Corporations are amoral. That is, they do not have a moral system. They simply make the decision that most benefits them. If they don't, their competitor does and beats them. So we shouldn't look to corporations to be self-regulating in a vacuum. We need either an informed moral consumer or an informed moral regulatory agency to intervene, to set limits. That's why I think criticism of crop tech giant Monsanto is a little out of place. Of course, they will do terrible things if it's very profitable for them. But when they're allowed to do these things, I view it as a regulatory failure, not a failure of the technology or the company. Protesting Monsanto, while it's going to make you feel good, probably won't do much to their policies. I think it's better to focus on smarter regulations and consumer education, and ultimately we need to reform the campaign finance system. In my humble opinion, the best thing that could happen would be a worldwide promotion of locally adapted crops and a serious reconsideration of what I see as the greatest sin in global agriculture, monocropping. There's too much wheat, corn, and soy in production in places where it barely grows. Not enough teff, millet, cowpeas, and yam. That's because the market for these commodities are not as strong, but it hurts farmers in areas where the cash crops don't have good yields. Here's my final thought on the matter. I worry that rich white people in the first world tend to focus on the possible effects GMOs will have on them at the cost of death, disease, and poverty in other parts of the world. There's a certain smugness about going to the farmer's market and buying organic, locally grown hobby garden products. It's right to be concerned about possible allergy or fertility or toxic effects in humans or the population of the monarch butterfly, but contrast that with the 16,000 children who die every day of starvation, the 1 billion people who go to bed hungry every day. I don't have all the answers on this issue, but I know whatever solution we follow, it needs to give consideration to butterflies, rich white people, but also the suffering and starvation in the world. We need to find the best and most ethical path, and the only way to do that is from a rational human perspective. Thanks for watching.
Genetically engineered crops in agriculture, a worldwide experiment on people, animals, and nature. Cultivation of genetically engineered crops like soy, maize, cotton, or canola have far-reaching consequences. 90% of genetically engineered crops belong to the corporate agricultural group Monsanto. The rest are owned by Syngenta, DuPont, Bayer, and others. Genetic manipulation of crops can have uncontrollable consequences. The function of genomes is only partially understood, but foreign genes are still introduced into crops. These genetically engineered crops are widely cultivated outdoors, where they cannot be controlled. Currently, 90% of GE cultivation occurs in the Americas, particularly in the USA, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada. It seems researchers have forgotten that genetically engineered crops once outside can no longer be controlled like they could in the lab. GE crops can self-replicate and pass on their new characteristics to neighboring crops, penetrating the fields of farmers who want to cultivate their crops without genetic engineering. Adverts from the genetic engineering lobby claim genetically engineered crops produce higher yields, but this marketing mantra is a complete hoax. It has been shown that crop yields for GE crops are no higher than normal crops, but farmers must buy more expensive patented genetically engineered seeds each year. This forces them to become dependent on corporate giants. But that's not all. Genetic engineering giants also produce pesticides and herbicides. There are two characteristic traits of genetically engineered crops. They are either resistant to herbicides, in which case the genetic engineering company itself produces the suitable herbicide, or the genetically engineered crop emits an insecticide. Whether or not the crops are resistant to weed killer or give off poisonous gases, not only weeds or pests are eliminated, other beneficial field growth and some living creatures are killed as well. But nature adapts, so pests and weeds develop resistance to pesticides. And that means that increasing amounts of stronger pesticides will be used. Especially grave consequences are observed in this respect in monocultures. For example, in South America, rainforests and other natural landscapes are destroyed every day to make room for genetically engineered monocultures and pasture. At the same time, the soil and groundwater are poisoned. On top of that, the genetic engineering lobby claims genetically engineered crops can help to reduce world hunger. Genetic engineering is not the answer. There is enough food on Earth. The problem is that it's not distributed fairly. But the fact is that most genetically engineered crops find their way into the livestock chain, so they end up as meat or dairy products in supermarkets. Along with all the destructive effects on the environment, one last awkward question remains. How do genetically engineered crops affect humans and animals? The answer is, no one knows. Therefore, it's important for you to carefully consider which products you buy. Get informed and get involved, because our world is not a testing ground. For more information about genetic engineering, go to greenpeace.org/GMO.
Pay close attention to what you are about to see. These images will be seen around the world. These rats have been fed with transgenic corn during their entire life cycle. The tumors they suffer from are enormous. The study that revealed the effect of the GMOs on the health of these rats has just been completed. It benefited from exceptional financial and technical means. We were able to witness the study in its entirety. It lasted for 2 years. Following years of doubt and controversies, will we finally know the truth about GMOs? Would we then be faced with a health crisis of global proportions?
This is the longest, most thorough study to have been carried out on a GMO, and we have also carried out a joint study on the most used pesticide in the world, the Roundup, which is a herbicide. It belongs to the main pesticide category. We spent over a year trying to obtain transgenic corn because no GMO manufacturers were willing to provide them. This is because Monsanto requires contracts to be signed stipulating that the seeds must not be used for testing and an arrangement must be made prior to the testing. We wanted our study to be independent.
This is the first time that a 2-year study has been conducted on GMOs. And there lies the big difference. Furthermore, we tried to evaluate a maximum of biochemical and biological parameters with repeated blood tests, weighing of the specimens, and urine tests. We studied the hepatic and urinary parameters, as well as the blood parameters, all the parameters that can be studied. We also studied the hormonal parameters, which has never been done in previous studies. This experiment is a world premiere.
Up until now, the corn NK603, the very one selected for the study, had only been tested over a 3-month period, and that in a test environment entirely controlled by Monsanto, its manufacturer. Furthermore, concerning the Roundup, also manufactured by Monsanto and which is used for growing corn, only its active agent, glyphosate, had been assessed. But one needs to understand that the manufacturers, in order to enable the active agent to penetrate the plant cell successfully, use additives that are sometimes more harmful than the actual glyphosate.
We have 2 clear objectives. Firstly, to conduct the studies exactly according to international requirements, but making sure to be very thorough when it comes to analyzing the results. Secondly, we want to determine if there are secondary effects. The only way to do this is to carry out tests on animals and then to examine all the blood parameters whilst paying close attention to their organs.
At this stage, it might prove useful to know exactly what GMOs are used for. It is a plant that has been developed either to produce its own insecticide or to be tolerant to a herbicide, thus enabling it to be exposed to massive doses of it without dying. One can understand how GMOs could be useful to farmers. For example, they would be able to spray their entire field with Roundup, killing all the weeds in the process and never harming the genetically modified plant. On the other hand, it is hard to see the benefits for the consumer, who will effectively be ingesting substances coming from a plant that has absorbed pesticides. That is why it is crucial to test not only the GMO, but also the GMO with its residue and the pesticide on its own.
This type of testing had never been done before because the corporations doing the tests would do them on GMOs with the Roundup, which meant that we had no idea what between the GMO and the Roundup caused the pathologies, or they did them on GMOs without specifying that this was the case. So what we decided to do was to address the question, are we dealing with the effects of the GMO or the pesticide? During the last 10 years of testing, the National Commission did not envisage a pesticide effect.
Therefore, Europe does not even demand that chronicle toxicity tests be systematically carried out on animals, and when they are required, it is the manufacturers who decide the protocol to be used. For example, the Amflora potato was only tested on a group of 30 rats, 10 of which were being fed the GMO. The Monsanto corn was tested on 400 rats. 80 of them were fed the transgenic plant, but only 40 of them were then subjected to blood tests. Either way, none of these studies lasted longer than 90 days.
What is represented by this figure is that certain groups of rats, male and female, have ingested GMO corn. GMO corn with Roundup residue and Roundup on its own. Every time we go up a level, a rat dies. The limit is 10 due to the number of rats that constitute a group. The dotted line represents the females of the group who die but have a completely normal diet. Only 2 animals die spontaneously after 550 days. On the other hand, every female that has been fed on the GMO with Roundup or Roundup diet has died more frequently than the other rats. Some will challenge the relevance of such results, but what is undeniable is that in the group that has been exposed to the GMOs, there is a 600% increase or 6 times more deaths compared to the control group. As far as medicine or biology is concerned, there is no need for further testing.
An important fact is that all the studies carried out on the rats are done over a 3-month period. It so happens that none of the effects are visible until the 4th month. This is fundamental in understanding that studies conducted over a 3-month period are useless. This conclusion is easily understandable. It could be said that their only use is to soothe the consciences.
Every rat out of the 200 that were tested was dissected by Professor Seralini's team. They did this to discover exactly what had affected their organs. The purpose behind this was to identify the way each diet, GMO and Roundup on its own, had acted on the metabolism of each animal, focusing on the development rate of the tumors that, and this comes as no surprise, only start to manifest themselves after the initial 3-month period.
This figure represents the number of palpable tumors contracted by the animal during the experiment. Here, we can see the rats subjected to GMOs compared to those with a regular diet. As you can see, very few males have contracted tumors. This is due to them being more resistant to the testing process. What these figures show are the large tumors. Each step up represents a large tumor, which can measure 17 millimeters by 17 millimeters. For a rat, these measurements are colossal. It would equate to a tumor of this size if seen on a human being. It is enormous. After having studied these tumors, it can be said that 94% of them take effect in the mammary glands, which would equate to breast cancer in a woman. We are faced with renal tumors for the males, but not only, some males also suffer from mammary tumors. This points towards a hormonal effect that isn't affected by the dosage. 60% of breast cancer cases are caused by hormonal deficiencies.
Professor Seralini's study holds one last surprise for us, and this is a major one. Up until now, one could have thought that the main cause of death for the tested rats was coming from the pesticide added to the corn. But what the study highlighted, and this for the first time ever, is the fact that the transgenesis itself could have killed the rats. What this means is that just by interfering with the genome of the plant in order to modify it, we are faced with repercussions that no one could have anticipated. This is enough to make us reconsider all the scientific precepts that led to the creation of GMOs.
Roundup had never been tested separately. Whilst conducting cellular studies, we saw that the cells of the liver, embryos, kidneys, placenta and the umbilical cord died much faster, and so we could deduce that there was a toxic effect on the organism. What can be said is that there is an increase in deaths due to GMOs and Roundups. The biggest surprise came when we realized that GMOs without any Roundup residue were responsible for an increase in the death rate of females and of some males. This could be the result of the GMO gene that has been badly assimilated by the plant and that has therefore resulted in a negative effect or due to a secondary metabolical effect.
What that means is that we are dealing with a GMO in particular, a modification of a cereal or a GMO corn. With regard to the genes inserted in the corn to make it a GMO corn can result in different effects. It is not because a certain GMO has a particular effect that other GMOs will have an effect, but some may even have more of an impact.
What is alarming, this is the GMO that is being eaten by the Americans, but also the GMO that has been approved for importation by European agencies, including the French ones, and that obviously contaminates our food.
Nowadays, only 2 types of GMOs are being produced in a few European countries. One is corn and the other potato. But what about the 27 million tons of transgenic soya that are unloaded each year in European ports? This soya is used to feed our cattle, but it also makes its way into a number of foodstuffs.
What we want to achieve with this study is a moratorium. The situation is serious enough and we're not going to eat everything and anything. We imported without knowing what was being imported, and the United States have produced crops without knowing what they were producing. There needs to be more studies of this kind, and GMO manufacturers need to conduct them before commercializing their products.
A moratorium on growing GMOs has been approved by most European countries. Now that we know the results of the study conducted by Professor Serralini, could it be time to extend this moratorium to all the GMO used in many of our foods? To establish an undeniable scientific truth, one needs teams, time, and means. Some will say that it takes too much time and that it is too expensive. But had we taken this precaution, could we not have avoided recent sanitary scandals? Will GMOs be responsible yet again for a calamitous scenario? And while we are waiting for scientific certainties, evidently, this is a risk we cannot afford to take.